The moment my father passed away, my stepmother vanished, leaving behind her 6-year-old son, as if he were just another burden too heavy to carry. Now, I'm the one raising him, fighting to keep him safe in a world that has already been so cruel to us both. But this isn't where my story starts. It began long before, in a house filled with arguments and shattered hopes. I was 6 when my parents' marriage crumbled before my eyes. Their fights were constant, a never-ending battle of words that left scars deeper than any physical wound. Though they never got violent, the shouting, the insults, the sheer hatred in their voices, it all weighed on me. Home was a war zone, but school? School was my escape. I would sit there, watching other kids laugh, talking about their weekend adventures, their family outings, their parents' love. And all I could think about was how much I dreaded going back home. My mother never hid her misery. She complained about her life relentlessly, making sure I knew just how much she despised everything about our existence. A homemaker by title, but in reality, she was a prisoner on our living room couch. She rarely moved, glued to the television for hours. Looking back, I think she was suffering from depression, though no one ever said it aloud. She barely acknowledged my presence, never even checking if I had eaten after school. Since my school was just a block away, a classmate's mother would pick me up and drop me home, my own mother too absorbed in her apathy to even notice. She only roused herself when it was time to cook dinner, though her meals were inconsistent at best. Sometimes too much salt, sometimes none at all. My father hated it. I hated it too. It was the spark that ignited their endless battles. If my dad dared to bring home takeout, my mom would explode, accusing him of wasting money, of thinking she wasn't good enough, of preferring filthy restaurant food over her cooking. And then the fights would spiral into deeper wounds, mocking each other's families, belittling insecurities. My father would call her lazy, saying she rotted on the couch all day like a potato. My mother would lash back, ridiculing his income, telling him he wasn't man enough to provide for us properly. And so it went, day after day, until their inevitable divorce. When they finally told me over dinner one night, I felt relief. No sadness. No tears. Just a quiet acceptance that this nightmare was ending. But my reaction sent my mother into a rage. She screamed at me, called me a heartless freak, accused me of being just like my father, selfish and uncaring. She ranted about how no one in the family ever respected her, how she was done with all of us. I didn't understand. What had I done to deserve her hatred? During the custody battle, my mother was finally forced to undergo a psychological evaluation. The diagnosis confirmed what I had long suspected: bipolar disorder and severe depression. The court deemed her unfit to be a parent. My father was granted full custody, while the judge left a door open. If she could prove herself stable, get a job, and stick to her medication, she might have a chance to regain custody in the future. Until then, I belonged to my father. We moved into a small apartment near his workplace. It wasn't much, and the neighborhood was rough, but my father reassured me it was temporary. He worked tirelessly, picking up extra shifts, promising me a better life. And he kept his word. Within a year, we moved again, this time, to a safer, quieter place. That's when she entered our lives. Stephanie. Or Steph, as she liked to be called. Our neighbor, with her ever-present smile and 2 adorable dogs. At first, I thought she was great. She was kind, warm, and best of all, she had dogs I could play with. But as she and my father grew closer, things started to shift. At first, she stayed in her lane, treating me politely but distantly. Then, she started sleeping over. And suddenly, everything I did became a problem. Why was I watching TV after homework? Why wasn't I washing the dishes? Why wasn't I cooking for myself? I was 8. 8 years old. Too small to even see over the kitchen counter properly, but she acted as if I should already be running the household. My father, blinded by love, or maybe just loneliness, ignored the warning signs. Then, the unthinkable happened. Steph moved in. And with her, the dogs. That's when she decided I had to give up my room. For the dogs. My father and I were stunned. She argued that her dogs had always had their own space, that they needed a proper room. And where was I supposed to sleep? In the closet under the stairs. A dark, cramped space that made my skin crawl just thinking about it. I refused. I screamed. I cried. And for once, my father stood up for me. He told Steph her demand was absurd. She threatened to leave. He refused to budge. In the end, they compromised. He built a doghouse in the backyard. But she never forgave me for it. From that day on, I wasn't allowed to play with her dogs. If they came near me, she would scold me like I was some intruder in my own home. That wasn't the only change. Almost as soon as she moved in, Steph quit her job. I don't know if she and my dad ever discussed it, but suddenly, she had all the time in the world to criticize me. She nitpicked everything. My cleaning. My eating habits. My very existence. And then came the questions. Why did your mother abandon you? Why don't you go live with her instead? My mother had never reached out to me since the divorce. And frankly, I had no desire to reach out to her. But Steph kept pushing, finding new ways to make me feel like an outsider in my own home. Every day, it got worse. And then, her complaints started piling up, aimed directly at my father. She told him I was messy, lazy, ungrateful. That I didn't listen, that I was a burden. And the weekend had been fun, maybe a little too fun. I had stayed out later than I should have with my neighborhood friends, soaking up every last moment before Monday rolled around. But whenever my dad and I planned a trip to the movies, especially for a Disney film, since he knew how much I loved them, Steph would tag along, not out of shared interest, but with an agenda. She'd hover at the ticket booth, trying to convince my dad to buy tickets for another film instead. He never gave in to her demands, which only seemed to fuel her resentment. If you're wondering why my dad was even with someone like her, the truth is, outside of their arguments about me, they actually had a strong relationship. They were solid, at least, that's how it seemed. But for some reason, I was the one thing about their lives that set her off. By the time I turned 11, Steph had already made up her mind about me. To her, I was too quiet, too withdrawn, completely unlike the kind of kid she thought I should be. She never hesitated to voice her disappointment, complaining that I embarrassed her because I wasn't one of the popular kids at school. She'd go on and on about her own childhood, reminiscing about how she was once a cheerleader, the kind of girl everyone wanted to be around. The contrast between us clearly frustrated her. And it wasn't just that, I slept too much on weekends, didn't help out around the house enough, didn't fit into the mold of the daughter she wanted me to be. So, I tried. I really did. I set alarms, forcing myself to wake up earlier for school and even on weekends. I'd wash the dishes, walk her dogs, offer to help with anything she needed. But no matter how much effort I put in, it was never enough. She always found something to criticize. The more she tore me down, the more I internalized her words. Anxiety crept into my life, lurking in the background of every interaction with her. Eventually, that nagging voice in my head, the one that whispered doubts and insecurities, sounded exactly like hers. That's how deeply her words cut. One of the worst moments came when she accused me of being selfish over food, of all things. It was a family barbecue, something she had planned with her side of the family. I had just come home after playing basketball, hungry in the way only a teenager can be. I grabbed a plate, thinking nothing of it, only for Steph to pull me aside, seething. She whispered sharply, telling me how inconsiderate I was, how the food wasn't meant for me. When I pointed out that my dad had paid for everything, her anger only intensified. She hissed that I was embarrassing her, that I was a terrible stepdaughter. As I grew older, her expectations of me only increased. More chores, more responsibilities. It didn't matter if I was exhausted from a full day of schoolwork, there was always something more to do. Wednesdays, I had to cook dinner for all three of us. Every day, I had to take out the trash. Cleaning the stove became my responsibility, and even when I did it, she'd nitpick, claiming I didn't do it right. But when it was her turn to clean, any mess she left behind was conveniently ignored. When I started taking swimming lessons, something I genuinely enjoyed, she made sure I felt guilty about it. She'd tell my dad he was wasting money on me, that I was spoiled. The worst was when her dogs got sick. Suddenly, she wanted my dad to cover their vet bills. Her argument? If he could afford my stupid lessons, he could afford this. My dad refused. She had to borrow money from her parents instead, and she hated it. Then, when I turned 13, everything changed. My dad and Steph sat me down, beaming. They were having a baby. My dad was thrilled, and Steph looked elated in a way I had never seen before. He told me she had proposed, and they planned to marry before the baby arrived, because, as he put it, it was the right thing to do. I just sat there, numb. I wanted to scream, to shake my dad and beg him not to make this mistake. But I was 13. What power did I have? Their wedding was a quick courthouse ceremony. Steph's parents and I were the only witnesses. Then, for their honeymoon, she insisted on Lake Tahoe, which meant I was left behind with her parents for a week. That was when I realized the cruelty ran in the family. They asked invasive questions about my mother, prying into things they had no business knowing. Then, they'd make offhand comments, suggesting I might be just as flawed as her because of her mental health issues. I should feel lucky, they said, that Steph even agreed to marry my dad despite the burden of having a daughter like me. Their words chipped away at me, making me feel like I was worth nothing. Months later, Paul was born. He was premature, tiny, and fragile. But from the second I saw him, he was my brother. There was never resentment, never jealousy. I had been lonely for so long that having a sibling felt like a gift. My dad adored him, but being premature meant Paul needed a lot of care. He'd cry through the night, and my dad, always the devoted father, would stay up, soothing him until the early hours before catching whatever sleep he could. Steph, of course, took over in the morning. But when I got home from school, she dumped him on me. No questions, no warnings, just handed him over like I was his second mother. If he cried, I had to feed him, change him. Homework? Didn't matter. Plans with friends? Forget it. If I even mentioned wanting to go out, she'd guilt-trip me, telling me I was selfish, that I should be helping the family instead. My dad never treated me like that. In fact, he encouraged me to have a life, to do normal things. But when he left on a 3-day work trip, things got worse. Steph expected me to take care of Paul, even at night. If he cried too much, she screamed at me. As a woman, you need to learn to care for a child, she'd say. Otherwise, no man will ever want to marry you. I had no choice but to learn, warming milk, testing the bottle temperature, burping him, bathing him. Every cry sent her into a rage, and I was the one she took it out on. And then my dad came home. That's when everything finally broke. The weight of it all crashed down on me. I had finally told my dad everything, the exhaustion, the resentment, the sheer unfairness of it all. I was sick of working myself to the bone while Steph acted like I was her personal nanny. My father was furious. He confronted her, voice rising to a level I had never heard before. He warned her not to treat me like an afterthought, told her that if she was overwhelmed, he could help. But she didn't want help. She didn't even want the responsibility. In a fit of rage, she admitted it, she didn't like being a mother. This wasn't the life she had envisioned. And just like that, she packed her bags and left. For weeks, my dad pleaded with her to come back. He had to take leave from work just to take care of Paul, and he was desperate. Meanwhile, Steph's parents didn't blame her, they blamed my father. They scolded him for standing up for me, telling him that in every family, the eldest child is expected to help the mother with the younger ones. That it was just tradition. Maybe he was too exhausted to fight anymore, or maybe he simply felt powerless, but when Steph finally decided to return, something in him had changed. He no longer cared. He let her do as she pleased, which meant one thing, she expected me to pick up where she left off. She dumped Paul onto me completely. At night, she made him sleep in my room so she wouldn't be disturbed. If I had plans with my boyfriend or friends, she would force me to cancel them or threaten to take my phone away. When Paul started crawling, she demanded that I baby-proof my entire room so that he wouldn't get hurt. And my dad? He let it happen. He never stood up for me again. He started working late just so he wouldn't have to come home and listen to me complain. Steph, on the other hand, was out drinking, partying, living her life like she didn't have a care in the world. She would stumble into the house, drunk out of her mind, barely making it to the bedroom before passing out. I knew then, I had to get out. The only way to escape this nightmare was to build a future of my own. So I buried myself in my studies, making sure my grades were perfect. I secretly researched universities, deliberately choosing ones far away. And then, I did it. I got accepted into a great college with scholarships. When I told my dad, he was proud. But Steph? She was livid. She accused me of intentionally applying to a school that was miles away just to spite her. I didn't bother arguing. That only made her angrier. She screamed at me, saying I had to find a college nearby because family should come before my education. But I refused. I packed my bags, and with the help of my boyfriend, I moved into my dorm. After that, my contact with Steph dwindled to nothing. She didn't bother speaking to me, furious that I had left her to take care of her own child. Even my dad grew tired of being stuck between us. College became my escape, my fresh start. I made new friends, built a life for myself. Then, in my second year, my phone lit up with missed calls. 23 of them. All from my dad. I had been out with friends, my phone on silent. I didn't see them until I got back to my dorm. My stomach dropped. I called him immediately. The moment he picked up, I heard chaos, screaming, glass shattering. My heart pounded. Dad? What's going on? His voice was strained, choked up. Something was wrong. Are you okay? I asked, panic creeping in. Then he told me. He had stomach cancer. I didn't believe him. What? He repeated it. No, that can't be right, I stammered. I asked him 3 times, hoping I had misheard. But no! It was real. My father had cancer. The air felt thick, impossible to breathe. And then, as if that news wasn't devastating enough, he told me something else. Steph had lost it when he told her. She freaked out, screamed, threatened to leave him. And then she actually did. She packed up her things and walked out the door. But she didn't go alone. She left my dad, dying, terrified, heartbroken. And she left Paul. Just abandoned him like he was nothing. I was furious. How the hell could she say something like that? I spat, my hands shaking. She said this wasn't the life she wanted, my dad whispered. She didn't sign up for this. I clenched my jaw. Every child's worst nightmare is losing a parent. And now, I was staring that nightmare in the face. I couldn't bear the thought of being away while he went through this. I made arrangements to leave. My professors were understanding, allowing me a few days as long as I kept up with my assignments. I booked a flight and went home. The moment I stepped into the house, the reality of it hit me like a ton of bricks. My dad was weaker, pale, exhausted. And Paul, he looked terrified. I knelt down, hugged him tight, and gave him some cookies, trying to comfort him while my dad and I talked. Over and over, he repeated it. Steph had said she didn't want to be with a dying man. But what sickened me more was that she had left her 6-year-old son without a second thought. How could a mother do that? I knew exactly how it felt to be 6 years old and have your whole world ripped apart. And yet, she had left him behind like an afterthought. If she was really so desperate to escape, why didn't she take him with her? Deep down, I knew the answer. It wasn't just about my dad's diagnosis. She had never wanted to be a mother in the first place. This was just her excuse to run. I tried calling her. I called her parents. Again and again. Nothing. No one picked up. I could have driven over to their house, forced a confrontation. But I didn't want to waste the little time I had left with my father. Every moment was precious. For weeks, I took care of him. I took him to his chemo appointments, helped him with everything he needed. And I looked after Paul, too. But I knew I couldn't stay forever. My classes were waiting, and my father needed 24/7 medical care. So, I made a decision. I found a cancer treatment center where he could be properly looked after. And as for Paul, I had no choice but to bring him to Steph's parents. When they opened the door, their expressions shifted from confusion to shock. They weren't expecting to see me standing there with Paul at my side. "What are you doing here?" they asked, their voices laced with unease. I was beyond furious. I confronted them right then and there. How could you let your daughter just walk away from her sick husband and her own child? I demanded. They hesitated, reluctant to answer. But I wasn't letting this go. I kept pushing, my voice rising. And then, finally, Steph appeared. I froze. She had been here all along, ignoring my calls, pretending like none of this was happening. "Stop yelling at my parents," she snapped, crossing her arms. "Or I'll call the police." I swear, if Paul hadn't been standing right there, I would have lost it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't care why you left my dad," I said, voice cold and sharp. "But you need to take responsibility for your own child." She scoffed, shaking her head. "Paul is your brother," she said smugly. "You should step up." My blood boiled. I had spent my entire childhood stepping up. But this was the final straw. I took another breath. Then another. Because if I didn't, I knew I would do something I might regret. I sat her down, my voice steady but firm. I told her straight, I was heading back to college, and my father had just been admitted to a cancer treatment center. There was no negotiation. Unless she wanted me to call CPS, Paul would be staying with her. As I bent down to kiss my little brother goodbye, my heart clenched. I knew I was leaving him in a place that had never truly been a home, but I had no choice. I had to focus on my studies, to carve out a future where I could support my father if he recovered, and Paul, if it ever came to that. Writing this now, the pain still lingers. My father didn't make it. We spoke every day, and each time he reassured me that he was getting better. But I knew. Deep down, I knew he was just trying to shield me from the inevitable. And through it all, Steph never called. Never asked about him. Never let Paul visit his dying father. I tried reaching out, but she ignored me, just as she always had. 2 months later, I got the call. The doctors informed me that my father had passed away in his sleep, in the quiet, early hours of the morning. The world felt hollow as I returned home to handle the funeral arrangements. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone. On the day of the service, Paul arrived with Steph's parents, but she was nowhere in sight. The moment he saw me, he broke free from their grasp and ran straight into my arms. I collapsed into his tiny shoulders, the weight of grief crashing down on me. He was all I had left. My only family. After the funeral, Steph's parents pulled me aside. They hesitated before speaking, and then they dropped a bombshell. Steph had left that very morning. She had been having an affair with an ex-boyfriend for years, they admitted, even while she was married to my father. They told me she had wanted out long before his illness, but had stayed, biding her time. When cancer finally gave her an excuse, she walked away without a second thought. I stared at them in disbelief. Why were they telling me this now? Why hadn't they stopped her? They looked guilty, ashamed, but the next words sent a chill through me. They wanted me to take Paul in. My head spun. I was still reeling from my father's death, still drowning in grief, and now they were asking me to take on the responsibility of raising a child. They tried to soften the blow, assuring me they would help when they could, but they were elderly and had their own health issues. They simply couldn't do it full time. I refused. Flat out. I told them we needed to call CPS to get the authorities involved. But they shook their heads. Even if CPS stepped in, they warned, Paul could end up lost in the system. And then came the guilt. You're all he has left. You're the only one who can give him a real home. Maybe it was the fresh grief, the crushing loneliness of losing my father, or the way Paul had clung to me during the funeral, but I knew in my heart I couldn't abandon him. On the same day I lost my father, I realized I had just become a guardian. I wish I could say it was easy, but it wasn't. I had no choice but to take a gap year from college. There was simply no way I could juggle raising a child with my coursework. My professors were disappointed. I had been a top student, but they understood. Thankfully, my father had left everything to me. I made the tough decision to sell his house and car, using the money to secure a future for Paul and myself. I couldn't stay in that town, it held too many ghosts, so I packed our bags, and we left. Paul was hesitant about leaving his friends behind, but the moment we stepped into our new life, I saw something in his eyes. Hope. He trusted me completely. He knew I would never leave him. We settled into a tiny apartment near my college campus. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I enrolled him in a nearby school, and from that moment on, my life became a balancing act: classes, work, and raising a child. The next 3 years were a blur of exhaustion and sacrifice. But watching Paul thrive made every hardship worth it. I fought for legal guardianship, knowing that his mother had abandoned him and his grandparents were in no condition to raise him. The process was grueling: papers, court visits, endless waiting, but I never wavered. When the final decision came through, and I was officially his guardian, I felt something shift. Paul wasn't just my responsibility anymore. He was my family, in every sense of the word. Despite the struggles, our tiny apartment became a home. Paul made friends, excelled in school, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly moving forward. When I finally graduated, everything changed. I landed a good job, and we moved into a better neighborhood. Life stabilized. Paul grew into a confident, happy kid, and I couldn't be prouder of the young man he was becoming. Sometimes, he would ask about Steph. He remembered her, of course. But he understood she was never really his family. I was. We spoke about Dad often. I made sure Paul never forgot him. Then, just a week ago, my phone rang. I recognized the number. It was Steph's parents. They checked in on Paul every few months, so I didn't think much of it as I answered. But the moment I heard the voice on the other end of the line, my blood ran cold. It wasn't them. It was Steph. The phone call from Steph was unexpected, and her words hit like a storm. She demanded to know where I was, why I had sold my father's house, and if Paul was living with me. I didn't hesitate. Paul was with me, safe and loved, because I would never abandon him like she had. I told her in no uncertain terms that she had no right to come near him. Her tone shifted, laced with bitterness as she reminded me that, as Paul's biological mother, she had a right to know where he was. I remained calm, telling her she could try her threats with the police, but it wouldn't change anything. I was legally responsible for Paul, and if she tried to interfere, I wouldn't hesitate to file a restraining order. I laid it all out for her, the truth of her abandonment, how lucky she was that I cared enough to step up for Paul, and how, had I not, God knows what would have happened to him. I could hear her voice crack through the phone, and for a brief moment, she sobbed. She claimed she regretted what she did, but insisted she was grieving. She begged for my understanding. I didn't buy it. I told her, calmly but firmly, not to call me again. Neither Paul nor I wanted anything to do with her anymore. With a final click, I ended the call, and in that silence, I felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. Anger at her betrayal. Sadness over losing my dad and all the hardship that followed. But, most of all, relief. Relief that Paul and I had made it through the storm, together. Yet, a small, nagging guilt followed me. Was I wrong for keeping Paul away from his mother? Was I being too harsh? The comments on my post poured in, thousands of voices sharing their stories. It was overwhelming in the best way. People who understood, who had been in my shoes as the oldest sibling, carrying burdens they never asked for. Their empathy made me feel seen, heard, like I wasn't alone. The majority of them agreed with me, reassuring me that protecting Paul was the right call. I took their words to heart and decided to document everything, just in case Steph tried to make things legal or turn it into some kind of dispute. I knew she wouldn't have a leg to stand on, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I sat down with Paul to explain the situation, to tell him about his mother's call. He listened, processing the words, and then, without hesitation, told me he didn't want anything to do with her. He understood why I had kept him away, and honestly, he didn't need her. He told me I was his real family, that he felt loved and cared for, and that was enough. I promised him then, as I had before, that his well-being would always come first. That he would never be blamed for what Steph had done. He deserved all the love and happiness in the world, and I would make sure he had it. Months passed, and I knew people were eager for an update. It wasn't easy to share what had happened next, but I felt it was important. I wrote an email to Steph and her parents. I wanted to make things clear. I began by letting Steph know, in no uncertain terms, that I was Paul's legal guardian now. I reminded her how I had taken responsibility for him when she abandoned him, how I had provided him with safety, stability, and a future. I told her Paul was thriving, he was excelling in school, making friends, adjusting well. I wasn't about to let her have any say in his life anymore. She had lost that right the moment she walked away without an explanation. I told her that if she wanted to maintain any communication, it would have to be through Paul's grandparents, and that would be it. I made it clear she had no place in our lives anymore. I ended the email hoping, praying even, that she would finally leave us alone. 6 months passed, and just as I had expected, Steph did nothing after reading the email. Her parents called to fill me in. It seemed that her life had taken yet another turn. The man she had left us for? He had moved on, engaged to someone else. And now, Steph thought it was perfectly fine to re-enter our lives like nothing had ever happened. Her parents were done with her too. They had made it clear they wouldn't support her behavior anymore. They assured me that they would continue to check in on Paul's well-being, and that they understood my decision to keep him away from Steph. As for Paul, he was thriving. He had celebrated his birthday with friends, and recently he had started rollerblading, a new hobby he was excited about. Things weren't perfect, but they were good. I had been working hard, doing everything I could to ensure Paul's future was bright, and it was all worth it. Seeing his smile, hearing his laughter, it made every challenge worth facing. Paul and I had each other, and that was all we needed.